It takes a long time to freeze to death. It isn't quick, and it isn't sudden. It is a slow, quiet conversation between your body and the cold. On November 12, 1912, a search party was walking through the white silence of Antarctica. The snow stretched out in every direction, flat and blindingly bright, unbroken by a single tree or a rock or a living soul. They were looking for 5 men who had vanished into the ice 8 months earlier. The world outside of this frozen continent had already mourned the Titanic that year. People in London and New York had wept for the passengers who drowned in the North Atlantic. But while the world was looking at the ocean, something else was happening at the bottom of the earth. Something much quieter and much more lonely. The search party spotted a small, dark shape against the endless white snow. It looked like a shadow at first. As they got closer, dragging their heavy sledges, they realized what it was. It was a tent. It was almost completely buried, just the tip of the green canvas showing above the snowdrift, flapping gently in the wind. The silence around it was heavy. They stopped their sledges. They brushed away the hard, packed snow with their thick woolen gloves. They undid the frozen toggles of the door. Inside, they found 3 men. They were frozen hard, like statues carved from marble. Captain Robert Falcon Scott lay in the center. His sleeping bag was open, the flaps thrown back. His arm was flung over his friend, Dr. Wilson, as if he were trying to protect him even in death. There was no fear on their faces, just a terrible exhaustion. And underneath Scott's shoulder, tucked away in a small satchel where he could reach it until the very last moment, was a small notebook. It wasn't just a logbook of coordinates and weather. It was a letter to the future. It was the voice of a man watching his own life fade away day by day, hour by hour, while the wind screamed outside. When we read history, we often think of dates and maps and flags. But the paper archive isn't about maps. It is about the people who held the pen when their hands were shaking. This diary tells us what happened in the silence. 1912 was a year that humbled humanity. It was the year nature reminded us that no matter how much steel we build or how far we walk, we are small. Just a few months before they died, Captain Scott and his team had set out with high hearts. They wanted to be the first human beings to stand at the South Pole. It was the greatest race on Earth. The British Empire was watching. The newspapers were waiting. They marched for months, dragging heavy wooden sledges across a landscape that wanted to kill them. They battled blizzards, hidden crevices, and temperatures that froze the sweat on their skin instantly. But when they finally arrived, exhausted and broken, on January 17th, they saw something in the distance, a black speck against the white horizon. It wasn't a rock, it was a flag. It was snapping in the cold wind. It wasn't their flag, it was the Norwegian flag. Roald Amundsen had beaten them. He had arrived 34 days earlier. Imagine that feeling, standing at the bottom of the world, thousands of miles from home, with frostbite gnawing at your fingers, looking at a piece of cloth that tells you lost. Scott wrote in his diary that night, "Great God, this is an awful place." They had traveled all that way for glory. Now they had nothing but the long walk home. But the tragedy wasn't the loss. The tragedy was the journey back. They turned around to walk 800 miles back to safety. They didn't know it yet, but they were walking into their graves. The return journey became a nightmare. The Antarctic summer ended, and the Antarctic winter began to close in around them. The temperature dropped, -30, -40. The ice became hard and rough like sandpaper against their sledges. First, they lost Edgar Evans. He was the strongest of them, a big man who had never shown weakness before. But the cold took him first. He collapsed at the foot of a glacier, mumbling and confused, and never woke up. They buried him in the snow and kept walking, because if they stopped, they died. Then there was Captain Oates. Oates was a soldier. He was tough, but his feet were destroyed by frostbite. They turned black and swollen. He could barely stand, let alone pull a sledge. He knew he was slowing them down. He knew that if he stayed, his friends would die trying to carry him. So, on the morning of his birthday, March 17th, he made a choice. He stood up in the tent. He struggled to his feet on his ruined legs. He looked at his friends, and he said the words that have echoed for 100 years. "I am just going outside, and may be some time." He walked out of the tent into a raging blizzard. He walked into the white darkness without a coat. He never came back. It reminds me of the young pilot we talked about in the last episode, Toshio Onizawa. That same quiet choice to leave so that others might live. But even that sacrifice wasn't enough. There were only 3 left now: Scott, Wilson, and Bowers. They were weak, they were starving, but they kept moving. They were aiming for a place called 1 Ton Depot. It was a supply camp full of food, oil, and warmth. They dragged their sledges until they were only 11 miles away. Just 11 miles, a single day's walk on a good day. They could almost feel the warmth of the depot. They pitched their tent for the night, planning to make the final dash in the morning. But that night, the wind began to scream. A blizzard descended on them with a fury they had never seen before. The snow swirled around the tent like a wall of white concrete. They couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. They waited for the morning, but the storm didn't stop. They waited for the next day. The wind kept howling. They waited for 9 days. Inside the tent, the temperature was deadly. They had run out of fuel for their stove. That meant they couldn't melt ice for water. They were dying of thirst in a world made of frozen water. And in that small, freezing tent, as the cold slowly took over his limbs, Captain Scott picked up his pencil. His fingers must have been numb. His mind must have been drifting in and out of consciousness. But he wrote. He didn't write with anger. He wrote with a terrifying calmness. Listen to the words of a man watching his own life fade away, day by day, hour by hour. Thursday, March 29th. Since the 21st, we have had a continuous gale. We had fuel to make 2 cups of tea apiece and bare food for 2 days on the 20th. He pauses here. You could almost see him looking at his friends. Wilson and Bowers were already unconscious. Scott was the last one awake. He continues writing. Every day we have been ready to start for our depot 11 miles away, but outside the door of the tent, it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for any better things now. The writing in the diary starts to change here. It gets messy. The lines start to slant. The cold is taking his hand. We shall stick it out to the end. But we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. He signs it, R. Scott. But he doesn't close the book. He thinks about the people who will find them. He thinks about his family. And with the very last ounce of strength he has, he adds one final line, a scrawl at the bottom of the page. For God's sake, look after our people. In the back of that diary, he wrote letters to the wives and mothers of the men dying beside him. And then he wrote to his own wife, Kathleen. He writes, "Make the boy interested in natural history if you can. It is better than games." He's thinking about his son's education while he's freezing to death. He writes, "The great God has called me. Take comfort in that I die in peace with the world and myself. I am not afraid." He wasn't afraid. It's a strange thing we see in these letters, whether it's Sullivan Ballou before the Civil War or Alexander Holverson on the Titanic. When the end finally comes, the fear seems to vanish. All that is left is clarity. All that is left is love. The search party never moved them. It would have been impossible to carry the frozen bodies back across the ice. So they collapsed the tent over Scott, Wilson, and Bowers. They built a massive cairn of snow on top of them, a white tomb in the middle of the wasteland. They're still there today, buried under a century of snow. One day, many years from now, the ice will break off and they will drift out to sea. A Viking funeral for the last great explorers. Why do we keep coming back to these stories? Maybe it's because in those final moments, all the noise of life disappears. There are no lies in a frozen tent. There is only truth. If this story stayed with you, there are other voices in the archive waiting to be heard, from the deck of the Titanic to the fields of Virginia. This is the Paper Archive. Thank you for listening.